In the year 865 AD, a storm unlike any England had ever witnessed was gathering across the North Sea. It wasn't a tempest of wind and rain, but something far more devastating, a storm of iron, ambition, and conquest. On the shores of East Anglia, a Viking fleet, unlike any that had come before, was preparing to make landfall. The local inhabitants watched the horizon with growing dread, knowing that their world was about to change forever. What they didn't know is that they were about to witness an invasion so coordinated, so relentless, so overwhelming that it would nearly erase the very concept of England from history itself. This is the story of the Great Heathen Army, and how a group of Norse warriors came closer to total conquest than anyone might have believed possible. To understand how the Vikings could nearly conquer an entire nation, we must first understand what England was in the 9th century. It wasn't a unified kingdom. Not really. Instead, it was a patchwork of competing Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, each ruled by ambitious lords who spent as much time fighting each other as they did worrying about external threats. Northumbria controlled the north, a vast and powerful realm. Mercia, the kingdom of the Midlands, was caught between ambition and decline. East Anglia held the east, and Wessex, though smaller, was beginning to emerge as a formidable force in the southwest. These kingdoms were separated not just by geography, but by history, by competing claims to power, and by the petty rivalries that defined medieval politics. They were vulnerable, and they didn't even know it yet. The Vikings who raided England in the centuries before 865 AD were opportunists. They came in small fleets, struck hard and fast, and disappeared back across the sea before significant resistance could form. Churches were burned, treasures were stolen, and monks were slaughtered or enslaved. It was terrifying, yes, but it was also scattered. A monastery in Northumbria didn't necessarily alert the king of Mercia. A coastal town in East Anglia faced its crisis alone. The system that made England vulnerable was its very fragmentation. Then, everything changed. The Great Heathen Army that landed in East Anglia in 865 AD was something entirely different. Historians debate the exact numbers, but most scholars agree it numbered somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 warriors, an enormous force by the standards of the time. But size alone wasn't what made this invasion different. What set the Great Heathen Army apart was its organization, its purpose, and its staying power. This wasn't a raiding party planning to grab treasure and sail home. This was an army of conquest, intent on establishing permanent Viking rule over as much of England as possible. The leaders of this force were men with vision, with strategy, and with the ruthlessness necessary to implement it. Among these leaders were the legendary brothers Ragnar Lothbrok's sons, Ivar the Boneless, and Halfdan. The exact historical reality of these figures is clouded by centuries of saga and myth. What we know is that these men directed a military campaign of stunning precision and relentless determination. They understood something that English kings had not yet fully grasped, that territorial conquest required holding the land, securing supply lines, and overwhelming potential resistance before it could coalesce. They studied their opponents, they learned their weaknesses, and they exploited them with devastating effectiveness. The invasion began in East Anglia, where King Edmund ruled. The Vikings moved quickly, establishing a stronghold and beginning to consolidate control over the kingdom. Edmund, realizing the magnitude of the threat, but lacking the military resources to mount an effective response, attempted to negotiate. He paid the Vikings tribute, a hefty ransom meant to buy them off. It was a decision that revealed the true genius of the Great Heathen Army's strategy. They would accept the tribute, yes, but they would also use that moment of relative peace to gather intelligence, to rest their forces, and to plan their next move. The moment of weakness would come when East Anglia's guard was down, and the Vikings would strike again. But the heathen army didn't simply remain in East Anglia. Instead, they did something no Viking force had done before. They moved inland, establishing a mobile base of operations. They seized Nottingham, a strategic fortress in the heart of Mercia. This was a direct challenge, not just to one kingdom, but to the idea of Saxon rule itself. The Viking army was no longer hitting coastal targets and disappearing. They were planting themselves in the middle of Anglo-Saxon territory, holding fortified positions. and daring the English kings to remove them. And when the English kings tried, the Vikings defeated them. The campaign that followed was a masterclass in military strategy. The Great Heathen Army would move from kingdom to kingdom, establishing strongholds, defeating armies, and extracting tribute. They broke the back of Northumbrian resistance by 867 AD, splitting the kingdom and establishing Viking control over the region. York fell under their control, becoming a Viking stronghold that would remain in Norse hands for decades. The speed and efficiency of these victories shocked the English kingdoms. Kings and nobles who had spent their lives in small-scale conflict suddenly found themselves facing an enemy that operated on an entirely different scale. But this time, there was no negotiation, no payment of tribute. Instead, according to contemporary accounts, Edmund was defeated in battle and executed. Some accounts describe his martyrdom, with arrows piercing his body and his head being severed and replaced on his body. Whether every detail is historically accurate, what's certain is that Edmund died. Mercia fell under heavy Viking pressure, and Saxon England was on the verge of collapse. The dream of Christian Saxon kingdoms seemed to be dying on the battlefields of the Nine Kingdoms. Yet history rarely moves in straight lines, and the Great Heathen Army's seemingly inexorable advance suddenly encountered something it hadn't faced before, an opponent willing to fight and capable of winning. Alfred would later earn the title the Great, and his struggle against the Vikings would define his reign and ultimately save Saxon England from erasure. But in those early years, this situation was almost desperate. The Great Heathen Army, now joined by additional Viking forces, turned their attention toward Wessex, the last independent Saxon kingdom of any real power. What followed was a series of desperate battles and uneasy truces. Alfred fought the Vikings, sometimes winning, sometimes losing. He paid them tribute when he was forced to, and he fought them again when he could. It was a campaign of grinding attrition where neither side could deliver the final blow. Then, in 878 AD, a turning point came. Alfred's forces defeated the Viking army at the Battle of Edington, forcing the Vikings into a defensive position for the first time. The subsequent Treaty of Wedmore established a boundary between Viking and Saxon territory, and perhaps more importantly, it established that the Great Heathen Army, for all its invincibility, had finally met an opponent it could not completely overcome. The treaty effectively split England in two, but it also meant that one part of England would remain independent, ruled by Saxons, and guided by a king with the vision and determination to rebuild. Looking back at the Great Heathen Army and its invasion of England, we see something that transcends mere military history. The Vikings came close, extraordinarily close, to establishing complete dominion over the island of Britain. If the Great Heathen Army had been just a little more effective, if Alfred had been just a little weaker, if Wessex had fallen, the entire trajectory of European history might have been fundamentally different. It failed to conquer Wessex, which meant it failed to eliminate the idea of an independent England. It failed to destroy the vision of someone like Alfred, who could imagine not just survival, but reconstruction and renewal. The Vikings established their rule across much of England, but in doing so, they also encountered a culture that, despite being pushed to the brink, refused to disappear. The Great Heathen Army represented perhaps the last moment when it seemed plausible that England would never exist as a unified nation at all. Yet it was also the moment that, by failing to completely succeed, set in motion the events that would eventually lead to the creation of the very kingdom that would come to define the British Isles. History, as it so often does, took an unexpected turn. The invincible army that seemed destined to conquer all had achieved conquest, but not completion. They had changed England forever, but not in the way they had intended. Empires that seem destined to fall sometimes survive. Invaders that seem unstoppable sometimes falter. And in those moments of profound uncertainty, individual leaders with vision and courage can alter the trajectory of centuries. Alfred the Great would use the breathing room he had earned to transform Wessex into a kingdom capable of eventually reclaiming all of England from Viking rule. But that is another story for another time. The Great Heathen Army was defeated not because it was weak, but because it met something equally powerful, a will to survive and the brilliant leadership to make that survival possible.